called Devoted. No one loves you quite like Mom. And it was interesting, a couple ladies made a comment to me about my title. They liked it. They were like, oh, that's so true. And they liked that title that I chose. And you know, if you thought about the word devoted, think about what your definition would be if you had to define the word devoted. Well, I came up with some synonyms for the word that I think fit pretty well. Devoted could include loving, loyal, faithful, consistent, dedicated, affectionate, attentive. Think about that. All those words describe what moms are. Those words describe a mom. And my title for this morning's teaching actually came from a book that I read by Tim Challies, and it's called Devoted: Great Men and Their Godly Moms. And after reading it, I love this book so much that after reading it, I bought 3 copies. And I gave one to my daughter, Becca, and I gave one to Amy, my daughter-in-law, and my niece, Roxy, because I was like, oh, I love this book. And so I can't take credit for that Devoted because it came from Tim Challies. But in the introduction of his book, Tim Challies acknowledges that boys, they do need fathers. The importance of the father and son relationship. It's important. You know, dads, they can model godliness towards their sons. They teach them masculinity. They can model within the home a godly marriage to their mothers, and they're preparing their sons for life. So a father-son relationship is very important. And he goes on to say that though that relationship is important, sometimes there's not a lot of attention towards the relationship between a mom and her son. And I want to just read to you what he writes in his introduction in his book. He says, but with all the attention given to a father and his son, I fear that too little has been given to a mother and her son, for this relationship too is uniquely precious and important. Sadly, we often look upon it with suspicion, as if closeness between a boy and his mother is a warning sign indicating femininity, or perhaps even latent homosexuality. We have names for boys who are close to their moms. They're mama's boys. They're sissies or pansies, or worse, a boy who is close to his mother is a boy who we believe to be weak or not strong. But it may surprise us, though, to learn how many of our Christian heroes were shaped by the attentiveness and godliness of their mothers. Even though they may have had fathers who were present, involved, and godly, still they would insist that their primary spiritual influencer was their mother. Wow. Well, I started reading the introduction, and I read that, and I thought, oh, this looks like it's going to be a good book. I was drawn in, and I couldn't wait to hear what he had to say. And you know, I raised a son, and I have 4 grandsons. So I was very interested to keep reading. Now, I want to say, for all of you moms who have daughters, don't tune me out, okay? I also have a daughter, and I also have a granddaughter. And you know, the dynamics of a mother-daughter relationship, the dynamics may be a little bit different, okay? But a devotion that a mother has towards her children, whether it's a son or a daughter, is the same. Wouldn't you agree? It's the same. She's devoted to every one of her children. It doesn't matter if it's a boy or a girl. And I want to encourage you today as a mom, whether you're raising a son or a daughter, and remind you that the devotion to your children, whether it's through the big things or the little things that you do for your kids, they matter. That devotion that you have for your kids, that unconditional love and sacrifice that you show towards them when it's easy and when it's not so easy, will impact their lives in ways that you may never even realize. Let me share with you another excerpt from the introduction to the book. It says, history tells of women whose love for the Bible shaped its earliest and most prominent teachers, and women whose unceasing prayers led to the long-awaited salvation of their wayward sons. It tells of women who were great theologians in their own right, yet whose only students were their own children. It tells of women who laid an early foundation in the lives of their sons, or I would also say in the lives of their daughters, that despite their best efforts, they could never undermine. It tells time and again of exceptional Christian men, and I would add women, who owe so much to their godly mothers. When I read that, and when I think about that, you know, like they say they owe so much to their moms, and it makes me think of, like, do you ever watch on TV, like, say an athlete wins a game, and who's he thanking? Thank you, Mom. I love you, Mom. Right? They give Mom that accolade. You know, they're in the middle of winning this huge championship, and who are they thinking about? Their mom. Their mom had such a huge impact on their lives. And I just think that's the sweetest thing. So generally, okay, women have that natural nurturing instinct within us. Just watch a little girl with her babies, right? She's a little mama with her babies. And when a woman becomes a mom, it turns into a devotion. So every woman kind of has that nurturing aspect to herself, right? But when she becomes a mom, it turns into devotion. She's devoted to her child even before that child is born, because that child is her own. Isaiah 49:15 says, "Can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb?" No. Children are born helpless. Every one of their needs is dependent upon another person. And that person, in most situations, is usually mom, because mom understands the child's needs better than anyone else. And you know, after reading this book, I now have a new little grandson. And so I've been observing over the last few months how he is with his mom. And it's so interesting. I'm more in tune to it. He knows his mama. He knows, he looks for her. He knows her voice. And you know, she can calm him down better than anybody else can. He knows her touch. He responds to her comfort. And you know, my daughter is devoted to her son and would do whatever she needs to do to meet his needs. And you know, I think what a blessed gift we have as women. No one can love our children quite like us, and no one measures up quite like mom. Now, I want to also recognize that there are women who adopt children or bring children into their homes. And it goes back to that nurturing nature that God has put in within women. That maybe a woman brings a child into her home and she hasn't bore that child, but she takes that child in as her own, and that devotion that she has for that child becomes greater and greater as she enjoys and has the joy of embracing motherhood. And now, you know, I'm not saying that it's always an easy thing when you go through that change in your life to become a mom, whether it's our natural child or a child that we bring into our home through adoption. But you know, when a woman starts to embrace that role as a mom, she develops a love and devotion for her children that runs so deep. And God has blessed us and designed us as women with the capacity to care and nurture and have that instinctive understanding of what our child's basic needs are. We have so much to be thankful for, and we wouldn't want it any other way, would we? No. Our children are blessings, and God has given us as mothers the privilege and opportunity to impact our children unlike anybody else. And in each chapter in Tim Challies' book, he shares a story in each chapter on the impact that a mother had on her son through a loving, devoted relationship. Now, some stories share that sons rebelled. They rebelled against their parents. They rebelled against the Lord as they grew into adulthood. But as God began to work in their hearts, these men remembered what their mothers taught them about God and the biblical teachings that they had when they were children. And what these moms taught their children impacted them throughout their lives. These moms didn't know what the future held for their children. They didn't know what their future was going to be with their children. But they poured into them, and not knowing what the future would be. And some of those moms in the book were poor. Some of them died young. So those children didn't have their mothers through their whole childhood or as they grew into adults. Their mothers were gone. Some of the sons rebelled, but God's plans prospered, and each mother had a lasting impact on her son. In Proverbs 6, verses 20 to 22, it says, "My son, keep your father's commandment and forsake not your mother's teaching. Bind them on your heart always. Tie them around your neck. When you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk with you. For the commandment, and we could say your father's commandment, is a lamp, and your mother's teaching is a light. And the reproofs of discipline are the way of life." What great truths there are in these verses for children to follow after what they are taught, what they learn from their fathers, and the teachings that they get from their mothers. It gives them guidance and a light on how to live their lives. So I want to take just a few minutes and consider a few areas where a mother's teachings and devotion become a light to help guide her children in the way of life. And I would say that the first one would be a mother's devotion involves faith. Now, I'm sure that I think everybody here is familiar with the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, right? And he had a disciple whose name was Timothy. And Paul wrote 2 letters to Timothy in the New Testament, and he loved Timothy, it says, as his own son. He called him his true child in the faith and his beloved son. He looked at Timothy as his own spiritual son. And the Bible tells us in the book of Acts that Timothy was the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer and a father who was Greek. So his mother was a Christian believer and his father was an unbelieving Greek. Now, Timothy's mother was committed to teaching him the scriptures. The Bible tells us so. And she taught him when he was a young boy. And it actually says it was his mother and his grandmother. I love that. And they devoted themselves to teaching. In 2 Timothy 1:5, it says, "I'm reminded," this is Paul talking to Timothy. He says, "I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well." So even though Timothy's dad was not a believer, God worked in his life through the teachings of his mother and his grandmother. And they had such a huge impact in setting the spiritual foundation for his life. And listen to what Paul again tells Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3. He says, "But as for you, Timothy, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus." Now, I know that as moms, sometimes things don't go the way we want them to, okay? We can get discouraged if things aren't done the way that we believe would be the best way for our children in setting the foundation for their spiritual lives. Maybe the way that they're being taught spiritually. Maybe your husband isn't as engaged as you would hope he would be. Maybe you're married to a husband who is not a Christian. Well, we're always concerned that if we don't do things the right way with our children, they won't follow after Christ, right? We are concerned about that. But Timothy's life and his example from the scriptures and from how his mother and grandmother taught him should be a great encouragement to you. The devotion that his mom and grandmother had in consistently training him in the scriptures impacted his life so strongly that it made him wise to understand salvation through Christ. Wow, Timothy did great things for the Lord. He did great things for God through his ministry. And as you think about this and how the devotion of a mother is so important in the faith that she has and what she gives to her children, I have on your handout there 2 questions that I just want you to kind of think about and contemplate. So as you think about the life of Timothy, okay, we just heard a little bit about his life. What does this show you about how God views the importance of your role as a mother? And how can you share the truths of Scripture with your children in a way that makes them wise for salvation? just a couple questions for you to think about. And another area where a mother's devotion becomes a life is the constant sacrifices that she makes. And I know that you make constant sacrifices on a daily basis. So many things happen in a mom's day. You would love to have some time for yourself, right? But the needs of your children, they keep you very busy. And you know, the life that you had before kids, those freedoms, they're limited now. And sometimes you feel like you have to deny yourself for the kids. You're making sacrifices. And a mother's devotion involves sacrifices. But I want to remind you that in the midst of the sacrifices, there are many blessings. And you know, God is always giving us blessings. Don't miss the blessings in the midst of your sacrificing. So let me run down just a short list of maybe what happens in your typical day. You're changing diapers, right? Continual changing diapers all day. You might be in the midst of potty training, which we were talking about a little earlier. It's very consuming, right? Very sacrificial. But in the midst of those things, you get a lot of hugs, right? And a lot of kisses, right? Right? Those are the blessings. And then you get to clean up messes, right? And you get to go do laundry, right? But then you get the cuddles because you read them books. Maybe you read some books before nap time, or you settle down in the afternoon and they love to snuggle up and they love to cuddle. Those are the blessings. Don't miss the blessings. And I know that after that, you know, they want you to get on the floor and they want you to play with them. And then you get to make the meals and you get to make snacks and you're wiping runny noses and you know, those are the sacrifices. And then you get to tuck your kids in bed at night and you get to have that sweet time. I know sometimes it feels very stressed when you're putting them to bed, but there's also very sweet times when they're going to bed. So don't miss the blessings in that. And when I was thinking about that little list I made, I thought, isn't it funny though how those blessings sometimes feel like sacrifices? Because you know, when kids, sometimes they give you a hug, they're wrapping their arms around your neck so tight that, and they're pulling your hair and you're like, oh, you know, it's almost too much. Or maybe they want you to get on the floor and play and you know, you're sacrificing to go get on the floor and play, even though that is a blessing. But you can see the kitchen right from where you're on the floor because you're seeing all the dishes that aren't washed and you're thinking, oh, I have to get up and go wash those dishes. So there's sacrifices, but within the blessings, there still can be some sacrifice. But you don't want to lose that. I just want to encourage you, don't lose that. And these times, these days go very quickly. And you want to just take advantage of that. And I understand, I've experienced it too, but those inconveniences and those sacrifices are God's blessings. In the big scheme of things, would you have it any other way? Would you have it any other way? No. Those little sacrifices that you give to your family each day, they matter and they have a lasting impact on your children. They bring your child security. Who do they run to when they get hurt? Say it. Mom. Who gives the best hugs? Mommy does. Who's the person that they want to play with? Mommy, right? Even though these day-to-day needs and responsibilities feel like constant interruptions, and many times they are, slow down and be thankful and remember that they just want to be with you because no one loves them quite like you do. Those are the little things, but what about the big things? I would consider some of the bigger things, the training and the discipline, teaching them about life, and the truths found in the scriptures, praying for them, praying with them. It's a sacrifice to be consistent in discipline, day in and day out, and to bring your life lessons that you're trying to teach them back to biblical truths. You get tired of repeating yourself over and over, but the devotion to discipline and teaching and training is worth the effort. It's worth the sacrifice. Taking time to listen and talk with your kids can be a sacrifice. You might have a little chatterbox at your house and they want to talk all the time. But or maybe you're putting them to bed and that's when they decide they want to have this great conversation with you, right? And you're like, oh please, it's time for bed. You're just looking forward to like a quiet evening, right? But those times, they, especially sometimes at nighttime, and you'll find this probably more as they get older, that's when they open up. That's when they share struggles with you. Maybe they're sharing a struggle with a friend about a friend to you. Maybe they're having trouble in school. Maybe they feel inadequate, or they just don't feel like they measure up. And you know, they want to share that with you. Who do they share their struggles with? With mom and dad, right? With their parents, definitely. And I'm not in any way undermining fathers here. I hope you understand that. I just want to encourage you as a mother, okay? But yes, they come to their parents, and you want them to know that you are there to listen, and that what they're sharing with you is important, and that you are devoted to them. You're going to help them and give them good counsel. And if they need you to just talk with them and encourage their heart, or they just need a hug, you're going to give it to them, because they come to you, because you're the one that they know that can be trusted. And you know, listening to them when they're young, so that they come to you when they're older. Think about that. If you don't give them the time that they want now, they're going to learn, oh, mommy's too busy, and they're not going to come to you later. And I know that it's a sacrifice, but it's worth that sacrifice. You want to build that relationship with them. You're the one who can be trusted in their life. That's why they come to you. They're not sure what's going on. They come to you because they trust you, because you're devoted to their best interest, and they know that. You're blessed to speak into their lives. It may not be convenient, but it's a blessing that should not be overlooked. And you know, as I was thinking about the sacrifices that we as mothers make in our lives, I was thinking in the scriptures of some mothers who made sacrifices, and there's some moms who made some great sacrifices for their children. And I thought about, did you ever think about Moses' mother, Jochebed? Think about what she did for her son. She knew that if she did not spare her son, put him in that basket and put him down the river, he would have died. He would have been killed. She willingly gave him up by putting him in a basket so that he would be spared. He was brought up in Pharaoh's house, and God used her son to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. The scriptures also tell us that Moses had such a close relationship with God that he was able to speak with God directly. Wow. Jochebed didn't know what her son's future was. She didn't know that he would become a friend of God, that he would be a great leader, how God was going to use him. The love and devotion that she had for her son was so great that she was willing to sacrifice and give him up so he could live. Wow. Do you remember the story of Hannah? The story of Hannah in 1 Samuel? To summarize it, Hannah wanted a baby so badly that her heart was so grieved by it. And the scriptures say she was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. Maybe some of you have felt that desire, that heart that Hannah had. Hannah made a vow to the Lord that if he gave her a son, she would give him back to the Lord all the days of his life. Wait a minute, think about that. She longed for a son, okay? Yet she told the Lord that if he blessed her with a son, she would give him back. Wow. Do you see what happened here? Hannah refocused her desires on the Lord, realizing if God blessed her with a son, it would be better for him to serve in the house of the Lord all the days of his life than to be in a home with her. That is faithful, sacrificial devotion to her child, to a child. Those are just two examples, and you know, thankfully, we as moms don't have to sacrifice to that extent. You know, a mother's devotion is sacrificial, sometimes to the point of denying herself and her desires. Okay, but we want to remember we deny ourselves in the fact so that God can be glorified and that God would work in our children. We need to be ready to do hard things for our children's welfare, and we may be called by God to do hard things for his glory. We have to be ready for that. Don't underestimate the influence you have in your child's life through willing sacrifices that you make every single day. So there's a couple questions that I want you to think about and ponder. Do you look for the blessings in the midst of the sacrifices that you make for your children? Do you hold your children with open hands before the Lord, willing to surrender them to his plans for them? I want you to just think about those things after you leave here and go home today. And there's one more area that I want us to look at when we look at a mother's devotion, and it should be our devotion toward prayer. A mother's devotion is dedicated to prayer. And I feel like you guys hear this out of my mouth all the time, but I feel very strongly that prayer for your children is vital. And Hannah was a great example of being faithful in prayer, believing that God would answer in a way that would bring him the most glory. I want to share with you out of one of the chapters of Tim Challies' book. And the title of the chapter is called The Virtue of a Pleading Mother. Now, many of you may have heard of Charles Spurgeon. Okay, he lived in the 1800s, and he was known as the Prince of Preachers. And Eliza Wesley was Charles's mother. She had 17 children, but 9 of them died as babies. She had a very hard life. She had her hands full too. And we read in the book that Charles, he was outwardly well behaved, but he was precociously aware of his deep depravity. That's what the book says. And when I read from the chapter, we're reading from writings from the 1800s, so it might not sound like regular English, but you're going to understand what he has to say. So let me just read it to you. I think it's the best way to sum up a mother's devotion to prayer for her son. And this is Charles Spurgeon talking here. He says, as long as ever I could, I rebelled and revolted and struggled against God. When he would have me pray, I would not pray. And when he would have me listen to the sound of the ministry, I would not. And when I heard and a tear rolled down my cheek, I wiped it away and defied him to melt my soul. But long before I began with Christ, he began with me. Christ began with him through the attentive ministry of his mother. And I want you to understand that Charles's father was a minister. He was very busy with ministry work at his church. And so his mother would stay home with the children, and she would teach them and train them in the scriptures. And one day, her husband came home and found the house quiet, And this is what her husband had to say about his wife, Eliza. It says, she was engaged in prayer with the children. I heard her pray for them one by name. She came to Charles and specially prayed for him, for he was of high spirit and a daring temper. Do any of you have one of those? So that's what he had to say about his wife. And when he saw that, he thought, you know what, those children are in good hands. He felt a lot of guilt leaving his wife to care for his children, but he thought, you know what, they're in good hands. And it says here that some of Charles's earliest memories are of his mother gathering the children to read the Bible to them and to plead with them to turn to Christ. To her children, she was not only a teacher, but an evangelist. It says it was the custom on Sunday evenings, while we were yet little children, for her to stay at home with us, and then we would sit around the table and read verse by verse, and she explained the scriptures to us. Wow, now that, just alone, to get all your children to sit and listen is a feat, right? And it says, and the question was asked, this is his mother asking the children, how long it would be before we would think about our state, how long before we would seek the Lord. Then came a mother's prayer, and some of the words of that prayer we shall never forget, even when our hair is gray. In these prayers, she pleaded with God to extend his saving mercy to her children. Charles remembered that on one occasion she prayed in this way, now, Lord, if my children go on in their sins, it will not be from ignorance that they perish, and my soul must bear a swift witness against them at the day of judgment if they lay not hold of Christ. Wow. The thought of his own mother bearing witness against him pierced his soul and stirred his heart. Her intercession made such a deep impression on her young son that many years later he would write, how can I ever forget her tearful eye when she warned me to escape from the wrath to come. Another time she wrapped her arms around his neck and simply cried to God, oh, that my son might live before thee. The deepest desire of her heart was to see her children embrace her Savior. Isn't that what every mother longs for? That's the desire of every mother. But the book goes on to say that he continued to rebel. He was brought up in that home. He had the love and the nurture and the training from his mother, and he continued to rebel. And then when he was older, doesn't say exactly when, I think it might have been in his early 20s maybe, it was a snowy Sunday morning, and he attended a church. And the pastor simply said, "Young man, look to Jesus Christ." And he cried out, "Look, look, look, you have nothing to do but to look and live." And it says the simplicity of the message was just what Charles needed. For now he understood that God was not calling him to do, but to believe. And he did. He put his faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. And then it goes on to say, soon after, he wrote a letter to his mother in which he expressed his enthusiasm and his gratitude. He paid tribute to her for being his foremost teacher and for being the one who had so often begged God for the gift of salvation. It says, "You, my mother, have been the great means in God's hand of rendering me what I hope I am. Your kind, warm Sabbath evening addresses," he's talking about those evenings when they all were around the table, "were too deeply settled on my heart to be forgotten. You, by God's blessing, prepared the way for the preached word and for the holy book. I love you as the preacher to my heart of such courage as my praying, watching mother." And then it goes on to say, and by this point they called him the boy preacher, and then he became the prince of preachers. And it says in one of his early sermons, he paid tribute to her in one of his sermons, and he said, "There once was a boy, a very sinful child, who hearkened not the counsel of his parents." Think back to that verse I read earlier, that, follow the commands that your father has taught you in the teachings of your mother. He didn't do that. He didn't do that. But it says, "But his mother prayed for him, and now he stands to preach to the congregation every Sabbath. And when his mother thinks of her firstborn preaching the gospel, she reaps a glorious harvest that makes a glad woman." Isn't that the desire of us all? I just think about that, and that one day our children will all walk with the Lord, and they will rise up and call us blessed. And I want you to understand, our prayers do matter for our children. Don't underestimate the power of your prayers. James 5:16 says, "The prayer of a righteous person," that's someone who's godly, a godly person in their faith. "The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working." Your prayers, you may not see answers to your prayers right in front of you, but the prayers are working. God is a faithful God, and you need to be faithful to pray for your children. So let me ask you two questions that I want you to think about. As you think about the ways you pray for your children, how much time do you spend praying for their souls? And do you pray with your kids? If so, do they hear you pray personally for their individual needs? So I want to just end with this. I want to remind you, God has given you a devoted, loyal, faithful, consistent, dedicated, affectionate, and attentive love like no other for your children. Love God, love His Word, live it out before your kids, and share what you know. Let your kids know how much you're devoted to them, but let them see most of all how much you love God and trust Him with the rest. Thank you, ladies.